Thank you very much, Graham, and thank you everyone for coming out. I had a wonderful day touring the campus and getting a chance to see for the first time UBC, which is amazing. And I'm enjoying spending a little bit of time in British Columbia and outside of Saskatchewan. It's still early in the process. We're gearing up towards writing a paper, and this is a bit early in the process, so I'm going to throw some things out. Hopefully, maybe get some feedback from you folks if you get some ideas out of there. But it's intended to be broad picture, broad scope, and hopefully something will tweak in your mind. If not, hopefully you won't be too bored with the talk. My goals are, firstly, to understand how the nature of disease has changed in Canada from the 1600s to the present. Now, that's more in terms of the paper here. I'm more along the lines of setting out a kind of a model for looking at that. But as I complete the paper, that's what I'm intending to do, is to look how things have changed in that period since the 1600s, so basically the contact period. I want to relate these changes to epidemiological models of health and disease. So just as an aside, after I finished my PhD, I did a postdoc in community health sciences at the University of Manitoba. And so one of the things that tweaked in my mind, that they pushed into my mind, was more epidemiological theory, more looking from an epidemiological perspective. So I was sort of the geographer mode, and I'd done my PhD, and there was a whole world of looking at disease that I hadn't considered going into that. So the postdoc was very good for that. So I want to look at some other models of health and disease, apply this to the work. I want to document how the process is played out spatially and across society. So spatially, looking at the differences in timing of epidemics and of disease outbreaks and what have you, in a general sense, in different communities, but also looking at how it played out differently in, say, Aboriginal societies versus white society, what have you, as it did. So we get a little bit of that today. I want to provide a means of better understanding historical processes related to disease. So this can hopefully provide a bit of a framework for historians who want to look at the history of society in Aboriginal society or non-Aboriginal society. A little bit of information on how to understand how disease may have played out in those societies. So my approach tends to be multidisciplinary. So that means I have a background in history, geography, and anthropology, and to a certain extent in epidemiology. And I like to bring in ideas and concepts and approaches from all of those. So I tend to do that willy-nilly, if you will. I have a focus on broad historical patterns and trends. And one of the things about when I wrote the dissertation, I wrote the book, it was about 550 pages and all sorts of minute details that probably didn't matter to anyone but me. And I focused a lot on those. In this case, I'm looking at the broader trends and the broader patterns. I'm looking for underlying causes. I want to understand, to a certain extent, how this came about, how these changes came about. And then I want to use case studies to try to understand and to analyze, to synthesize the existing literature and introduce new material. So you'll get not necessarily in the talk, but in the paper you will get a sprinkling of both. The overall structure relates back to an epidemiologist, Abdul Amran, who wrote a paper back in 1971 called The Epidemiological Transition. I hate it when I do that, but sometimes I put that in. Basically, Amran provided a model of disease, health and disease change and development. So as things develop, diseases in society change. It built on the model of the demographic transition. Some of you may have been familiar with that. That suggests that as societies develop, their birth rates tend to fall, and eventually the death rates tend to fall, the birth rates eventually fall, and they reach a sort of state of equilibrium as we are now, with low birth rates, low death rates, and static populations. This built it on it to look at the disease that would occur in any portion of that transition. And he suggested there are 3 ages of transition. So the first age, and these are kind of quaint terms, goes back to the early 1970s, but the age of pestilence and famine. So the earliest period is the age of pestilence and famine. I'll go through these one by one. The age of receding pandemics. And then finally, the age of degenerative and man-made diseases. And if you look at the situation in Canada, that's where we're headed. That's where we really are for most of Canadian society. Although for Aboriginal people, it's quite different. There are 3 basic profiles and models of transition that he also presented, and I'm not going to go into those. If you're interested, you can always read up on the epidemiologic transition. So for me, this is a very interesting paper, but a very interesting way of looking at the changes in disease patterns in Canada across time. So we're going to start with the age of pestilence and famine. So Amran's first age is one of frequent death, so high death rates, population stability, so high birth rates as well, It's a pre-modern, pre-development phase. There's a high birth rate, high death rate, relatively short life expectancy. He suggested between 20 and 40 years on average. That may be exaggerated, and again, because I come from a background looking at Aboriginal people, I tend to discount some of that talk of the short, brutish, nasty life, at least for some Aboriginal groups. But for purposes of this model, 20 to 40 years on average in terms of lifespan. As a result, the population tends to remain young, is young, remains young. The mortality is largely due to infectious disease, accidents, and violence, and periodic deprivation, so starvation, if you will. The pattern of infectious disease mortality reflects epidemic peaks. So we're looking at spikes, periodic spikes in mortality due to sudden outbreaks of disease. So you'd be going along and with a high level of mortality, and all of a sudden there'd be a spike that exceeds that, and there might be actual population decline. This can be applied to the history of Canada for the most part up to probably the late 19th century. We're looking at the prevalence of the importance of infectious disease. This is for our purposes, the age of pestilence and famine can be applied or characterized as existing up until certainly the mid, maybe the late 19th century. And looking at the disease history of Canada, some refinement, though, of this model needs to be done. It's required to account for external influences. So what he's talking about, what Amran's talking about, is basically the situation in any given society about what they face in terms of internal health threats. What I argued and what I looked at in terms of my PhD in the later book was that we have to look at external influences. And when you're dealing with Aboriginal communities, external influences are the most important because the disease is coming from outside for the most part. Although now, again, with diabetes, it's coming from the inside, even though that relates to culture change that's generated often from outside policy. So we need to look at outside influences and outside sources of disease. So what I came up with was, well, we'll start with looking at the pre-contact disease in the Americas, because I want to reinforce that things were quite different in the Americas prior to contact. I think most of you will probably be quite aware of that. It's one of the things that when I was writing my master's thesis back in the late 80s, it wasn't even hardly on the radar. Nobody really was very interested in or knew much about the pre-contact, or the Columbian exchange, as they call it, and pre-contact disease. With the 500th anniversary of Columbus, everything changed, and everybody was soon an expert on disease and post-Columbian disease, so Columbian exchange. Now, these are a list of various diseases that are thought to have been, although not all of them are known to have been, indigenous to the Americas in some place. But one of the things you want to emphasize is that it varies, can vary from society to society, but also across space. So if we start looking at, in terms of these kinds of diseases, many of them would have been extant in, say, the equatorial regions where it was warmer and a more diverse biotic and other environment. So a more diverse environment leads to more disease. So if you're living in the Arctic, your disease load is probably a little bit less than if you're living in Mexico or Central America or what have you. So these are the kinds of some of the typical things that people have identified in the past. I think there's probably been a few additions to the list since I've done this. Syphilis is always controversial. There's some suggestion that it was indigenous, but there's other people who suggest that it was brought by Columbus's crew, actually, and then introduced and then reintroduced in a modified and mutated form back into Europe. So again, it's somewhat controversial. But the idea we wanted to take away from this is that there was a much more limited, there was certainly a rich disease load, but it was much more limited when we compare it to the old world. So what might this have been? And I'm a little bit off topic here because I'm talking about pre-contact, but it's still important, I think, to understand why we're dealing with the change. One is the cold screen theory, the thought that people had migrated across Beringia, Bering Strait, which was then not a strait, because of the decline of the lowering of the ocean level. Because of the cold weather, it might have eliminated some diseases, although it doesn't explain all. Certainly the chronic diseases, it wouldn't explain something like tuberculosis or what have you. Limited urban development was thought to be a case in the past, although we know there are very large urban societies in the Americas, particularly far south of here, at that time, that could have hosted diseases. So they were large enough to have hosted crowd diseases, as I'll talk about in a minute. So that is a bit off the list now. Ancient isolation, many of the diseases that we know had greatest impact during the contact era were actually were actually created or developed, came into being anyways, after the cessation of contact between the old world and the new. And the last, and what may be the most important, is the lack of domesticated animals. And a lot of the diseases, in terms of crowd diseases, actually came from domesticated animals. So smallpox, it's theorized that came from cowpox or from cattle, a disease of cattle, and other diseases from horses and what have you. So having domesticated animals was one of the worst decisions in some cases back in the old world in terms of disease. And they didn't have as many species, and I won't get into the ones they did, but certainly didn't have as many domesticated species, and that was may have led to a lessened disease load at the time. So I'm looking at the Columbian Exchange. As of the last decade of the 15th century, the Western Hemisphere, comprised of the Americas, had been almost completely isolated from the Eastern Hemisphere, including Europe, Asia, and Africa for thousands of years, with few exceptions. And it showed in terms of the disease load. So we're looking at a reduced disease load in the green area. I wish I had a laser pointer, but I don't. But anyway, in the green area, we're looking at a reduced disease load. This changes during the era after the arrival of Columbus, and we start to see a whole lot of new diseases appearing in the New World. So some of them are of importance here, some of them are less important, but certainly important nonetheless. Things like chickenpox, measles, influenza, mumps, although influenza may, again, it's difficult to say, but may have been some influenza here, but it's generally lumped in with the old world disease imports. German measles, rubella, smallpox, whooping cough, and so on. Malaria, again, I wonder about that one, but it generally appears on lists as well. It's a disease that could easily have been appeared in the Americas. So without further ado, we'll get on to this. Pardon me. Okay, so crowd diseases and their agents, not that it matters all that much. The ones that we look at in terms of the agents, many are viral, but the important ones are indeed chickenpox, measles, influenza, caused by influenza virus, most of these viruses, mumps, rubella, variola, and pertussis, whooping cough from pertussis bacteria. Most of these, we do not have any dealings with as individuals. My children would not have contracted most of these, certainly influenza they would have. They did have chickenpox, but there's a vaccine now for chickenpox. So I have a small scar on my shoulder for smallpox vaccination. Most of you, I do think, would not, because I think most of you were born, I know some of you were born before the late 1970s, but most of you were probably born after the 1970s, and they ceased to vaccinate for it because the disease was considered to be no longer extant or alive, other than a couple of supplies in Moscow and Atlanta. Others, mumps. I had mumps when I was a child. I've had influenza many times. I've had chickenpox. I've had measles. I've had German measles. Never had whooping cough, thank goodness. It's not a very nice disease, and I've seen many records of children almost choking to death and turning blue because of whooping cough in Aboriginal communities. But the point is that these were very, very important diseases in the post-contact period. They were the kinds of things that were killing off thousands, hundreds of thousands in some cases, perhaps even millions, depending on how you estimate things, of people in short periods of time. So they're old world disease imports. They have great importance, and they're really not that important anymore in terms of from our perspective. They can be. Occasionally they'll flare up. People are starting to not take their vaccines or not have their children vaccinated, and that becomes an issue in terms of some of these diseases. I'm just going to take my watch off so I can keep track of my time. Sorry. Now, and certainly in terms of whooping cough and a few others, some of these these diseases have certain characteristics which are very important to acknowledge they are acute. That means they are of short duration. So we'll talk about tuberculosis later, which is a chronic disease. Tuberculosis can last for years, certainly months, but for years, can go dormant and last for decades. But these diseases are acute diseases. They are infectious. That means they can be transmitted between humans, whether directly or indirectly. They have no animal reservoir, which is important, although not so important for the talk. They provoke lasting immunity, or many of them do, with some exceptions, and one of those is influenza because of the mutations. They're diseases of children or childhood in larger urban centers. That is, that you would expect to have many of these diseases if absent vaccines at the ages of about 5, 6, 7, somewhere around there. It partly depends on what age you first go to school and the dynamics and size of the community. And they're density dependent. That's a very important characteristic. They require, and they did require, large cities to exist and to be maintained. Otherwise, through the lasting immunity, they would quickly eliminate all the potential susceptible people. So this, to give you an example, is a rather famous one from a fellow by the name of Cliff, who did work with Peter Hackett and some others in Australia and other places, and they looked at the incidence of measles and trying to figure out at what point would measles become endemic. It's roughly 250,000 to 500,000 people. So in a community smaller than 250,000, you're unlikely to have an endemic supply of measles, if you will, endemic cases of measles. And it's important because if you have endemic cases of measles, you'll have periodic outbreaks, but you'll have sort of constant presence of the disease. And 7-year-olds will contract the disease. And you can generally recover fairly well if you have a small number of 7-year-olds or 6-year-olds or 5-year-olds or maybe even 10-year-olds contract the disease. And then periodically you'll have a peak as whoever was missed in the last, endemically, you will have a sort of periodic epidemic. Now, in the case of smaller communities, and these are sort of middling-sized communities, I think it's about 50,000 to 250,000, and then smaller, or 5,000 to 250,000, and in smaller communities, you see that they miss epidemics. So unless it's introduced from outside that community, there will be no disease there. And what's interesting is if a disease is present fairly close, in a community, a larger community fairly close, you'll still see regular epidemics, you'll just have it missing in between. What this means is that in these communities, you're never going to be more than, let's say, 10, 12, 15 years old and be susceptible to the disease. Now, if you have a situation, this applies very much to Aboriginal communities in Canada, where there might be 20, 30, 40, 50 years, 100 years between the epidemics, it means that the majority or all of the people in that community will be susceptible to measles. It also applies to a certain extent to early non-Aboriginal communities in Canada and in the coastal United States. So these are the kinds of things that are important in terms of considering what the severity of the impact will be and the duration and how often it will repeat. So I came up with a model. It's based on one that was actually done by William McNeill. But I wanted to explain what was the difference in terms of the behavior of the disease, because I knew that if you had, for instance, measles, and I'd had measles when I was a kid, and I was sick for a little while, but it wasn't so bad, and I didn't have any major side effects, and I recovered very quickly. You have a disease that is capable of killing tens or hundreds of thousands of people that I contracted and didn't die, and in fact wasn't overly sick. And one of the reasons that that would occur was because of where I lived. I lived in Winnipeg at the time, and the disease was probably endemic in Winnipeg. So we're dealing with mid-60s to, yeah, probably mid-60s, maybe the late 60s. But anyway, the disease is endemic. I was an individual. The rest of people in my family, the older ones, had had the disease before. Everybody could nurse me and so forth. So as an individual, I'm suffering from the symptoms. I'm not suffering in terms of deprivation and other things of aversions or epidemic. So I lived in a condition like this. It's an urban center. There's endemic die-off, so occasionally, a very small percentage of kids like myself would have died of the disease. But for the most part, you're going to recover. Same thing with mumps and a few other diseases as well. As one gets into a smaller population, or a population that is too small to host it, or is farther away, I should be farther than Mike, you will find that there still have periodic epidemics that are a bit more severe. In some cases, there might be fairly closely spaced. But it's really critically when you get into this epidemic pattern, so very far away from that source of disease, so a pool of disease, that you suddenly become very susceptible in terms of the whole population. So if we look at the periodicity of smallpox epidemics, for instance, on the prairies of Canada, and we're looking at maybe every 50, 60, 70 years, some cases 100 years, something like that, you're looking at an epidemic that would take out most of the population. So not in terms of mortality, but certainly morbidity, and a very good percentage of those people would die. So living in these conditions may free you from disease for long periods of time, but eventually you're going to sort of pay the piper because you will end up having a massive epidemic that will kill people off. So that's part of the reason we have those major epidemics among Aboriginal communities in the past. Now, in terms of thresholds, I'll just quickly go through these. There's a few here. Chickenpox is somewhat sketchy, so I don't necessarily believe it. But certainly measles at 250,000, I think, is acknowledged through mathematical models. Smallpox somewhere around 200,000. Rubella German measles at 132,000, let's say, and then influenza at a much higher number of population than we're going to find because of the ability to mutate. So there is no, would not have an endemic situation with the influenza. So we're susceptible periodically to influenza. So you're dealing with populations, if we look at the Canadian history, that were not available until much later on after contact. 250,000, you're probably looking at quite a bit after certainly the contact period. And even in the United States, you're looking at much after. Now, I put an example in, it's an American example of all things, but it's a great example by a geographer, Gerald Pyle, who did a study, I think it was back in 1969 he did the study. And it was a study of cholera. And I use this as an example in my courses, or a couple of the courses anyways, one to show off what cholera is, another to show off diffusion. But what you get is a similar pattern to what we would have found back in, say, the 1600s. In this case, cholera was a disease that was introduced, actually endemic in India. It was introduced in several pandemics. That's very widespread epidemics starting in the 1800s. The last one was, I think, in the early 20th century. I may be wrong, but certainly there's a series of epidemics, pandemics, that's right, including the United States and Canada. So in this case, what they've got is they've got it coming through New York. It's actually coming through Halifax and Montreal at the same time. So the pattern is what you're finding in the States, but it's very similar to what you'd find in Canada. So what you have here actually is a pattern of entry on the coastal part of the United States. Now, what Patton looked at was the timing and the nature of the communication of the disease. And he was looking at whether it was a hierarchical pattern or a contact or contagious pattern of diffusion. It isn't as important for me, but what it does say, what his results did say was that if we look at the interior, in this case, is a very poorly defined urban hierarchy outside of the coastal areas. So it's quick to diffuse to the coastal areas, but very slow to diffuse into the interior of the country. The other thing was that there was the lack of transportation, what we would consider to be effective transportation at the time. So you can see, for instance, whoops, that was not good. Going down major rivers and up and down major rivers, especially Mississippi there, but it limits the ability to diffuse and to spread during that period. You fast forward, this is 1832, fast forward probably to 1849, you start to see different changes. And this is what's happening in Canada as well. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to show this. I haven't got any examples that I'll show here, but I will put some in the paper. But you start to see diffusion starting again in New York, and again it's in Canada as well, pardon me, and in New Orleans as well. And you start to see the effect in the east of a very rapid form of diffusion, partly spurred by the growth of larger and larger cities in the eastern part of the United States, and partly because of the arrival or the construction of a railroad network. So you're starting to see a nascent urban and transportation hinterland for the urban areas on the coast. You also start to see the effect of, I'm just going to stand and walk in front of here, long distance migration of non-native people into what are traditionally native territories. So you're starting to see, for instance, people moving to California, the 49ers, and other people moving on, they move on to Oregon and what have you, and in the Northwest. And they're bringing families, but they're also bringing the disease with them. So this happens actually quite a few times where they're moving across the sort of middle of the United States, and it happens in Canada as well, is that they bring the disease with them. So as we get movement away from the coast, we get people moving away from the coast, they spread the disease with them. So the urban hierarchy initially is on the coastal region, then it's spread along into the interior and beyond. So that's kind of what I wanted to look at in terms of infectious disease. That's really short, but I wanted to sort of fit in all of the three ages. So the second age is the age of receding pandemics. So importance, well, certainly there's a huge importance in those kinds of infectious disease and those acute infectious disease, both in Canada, the United States, and in white populations as well as non-Aboriginal populations. As we get into, I guess, probably about the mid-19th century, more industrial and urbanized era, we start to see larger numbers of people living in cities. We see class differentials emerging that may not have been there to a great extent. We start to see people living in very crowded conditions, in poverty and what have you, in poor environments. And what that means is that we start to see the rise of other diseases that take the place of these acute infectious diseases. So things like tuberculosis. So the sort of case that I'll look at is tuberculosis. So tuberculosis, and I've been working on tuberculosis for a while in the Aboriginal context, but also in the non-Aboriginal context. as well. So it's a transitional disease. It's a disease that indicates something is going on in a society, something is changing in a society. And that something may be a transition between rural to an urban lifestyle, or, as in the case of Plains people, Plains Aboriginal people, reserve period with declining bison stocks and food problems and what have you that may have led to these kinds of disease. So certainly it's a disease that indicates a transition. So we have it's chronic, that means long term, it's infectious, and it's also communicable, and you can spread it often directly through face-to-face transmission, usually through sneezing and through spit and other things that might get into the dust and what have you. It can also be spread, certain forms of it, through actually through milk and cow's milk, bovine form of tuberculosis as well. It's sensitive to differences in socioeconomic status and class. So it's an indicator that something is going wrong in the population. Now, as an aside, we're currently having problems, and we mentioned this when we talked. I think we did. We talked about the problems in Manitoba and Saskatchewan currently with northern communities where there's a resurgence of tuberculosis in some northern communities. It suggests, and also in Winnipeg, among indigenous populations and immigrant populations as well, it suggests something is going on that is wrong and something is happening that needs to be looked at, if you have the will to look at it. So the sensitive difference in socioeconomic status, changes in prevalence may reflect social and economic disruption, as I'd argue, that occurred in the 19th century, and it favors urbanization. So it's very sensitive to crowded conditions. As you crowd more people into a residence, into a building, what have you, they breathe in close contact, and they're more likely to spread. There's a correlation between the number of people living in a house and the degree of spread of the disease. So it favors urbanization, and it favors industrialization for that reason. And there's increasing importance during the 19th and early 20th century. So we start to see spikes in rates among non-natives, but especially among native people in the late 19th century in the West, and I believe here as well, and then on into the early 20th century. And I put in the quote from Osler, which is a wonderful quote. Tuberculosis is a social disease with medical aspects. In other words, you look first at the social causes, and then you consider later the medical aspects. He's right on that. But anyway, there are many factors that affect the development of active TB. So you can be exposed to it, and you can inhale Mycobacterium tuberculosis and not necessarily contract the disease. So some of these that would include things like malnutrition, physical exhaustion, stomach acidity, stress, crowding, homelessness, urbanization, and then other social economic status, things like education, housing, quality, income. But the idea is that a lot of these things were becoming more prevalent, more common during the 19th century into the 20th century as people started to live in poorer housing conditions and more industrial conditions and were being exposed to the tuberculosis bacillus. So that's the kind of thing in terms of TB. Now, over time, we start to see a decline in the rates of tuberculosis. Now, first you're going to see the decline in the white rates, which I don't have here, but I'll have the data for when I do the paper. So this is an example of declining First Nations tuberculosis between 1935 and 52. 1935, government started to put actual money into the treatment and diagnosis of tuberculosis, and therefore you start to see improvements. And you see more improvements leading up to 1952. By the time we get to the 1960s, as we'll see, the rates were fairly low in terms of mortality. Morbidity was still a problem. So one of the things that occurred, and this is from a different paper I did, I don't know if you guys may have read this one, but anyways, we started to see increased case findings across Canada. It's fascinating when you look at the records, you start to see the records of year-to-year tuberculosis surveys. So they get an x-ray in, they x-ray everybody in terms of the Aboriginal community. They've been doing this for decades in white communities, so it's something that they've been doing previously. And the importance of case studies is that once you identify someone who is TB positive, has active TB, you can remove them from the population, hopefully get treatment for them, but it removes the possibility of transmission. So you remove them from the transmission cycle. In Aboriginal communities, even if you had, prior to that, even if you knew people had tuberculosis, you simply sent them back to their community. So therefore, once back in the community, they would spread the disease to the young, to various other people as well. So in the 1930s, we start to see people, the federal government starting to take case finding, I should say, seriously for First Nations people, not later for Inuit, but in the 1930s, 40s, we start to see it, and first for the South. And again, I think I may have mentioned this, is what happens first is the people who were the biggest threat to white people were identified and treated first. So any community that was in the southern part of, say, Saskatchewan or Manitoba or British Columbia, that was considered to be a threat to white communities, and therefore money was put aside by the federal government for case finding, removal, and then they would be sent to a sanitarium. Later on, it's not till the 1940s that you start to see these kinds of surveys. And it's a fascinating one because it's done by air and it's done by rail. So they're using the new technologies, the new transportation technologies to their advantage to treat these things. But this is something that didn't occur in the past. So what went on in northern Manitoba, for instance, prior to the 1940s, they would not have known. They would not have had any idea how much tuberculosis was going on at that time. The other thing is, and I'll go very quickly over this one, is you start to see improved opportunities for Aboriginal treatment facilities, especially sanatoria. The ones we want to point out here are Brandon Sanatorium here. Actually, this one here is going over. This is the provincial. What they do with the provincial sanatorium is they reserve certain spots for Aboriginal people and they send them there. But the big ones are Dynavore, which is in the late 1930s, and it's set aside as a tuberculosis hospital. Brandon, after the 1940s, Brandon is, pardon me, that's, anyway, what's that? Oh yeah, sorry, 1947, and then Clean Waters, 1945. So after the Second World War, white rates are declining. They have facilities that they could be used for Aboriginal people, and they start using them. So there's more money put into it. Coincidentally, the war's over, and you've got the manpower and the ability to provide that. Anyway, so that's one of the reasons why we get the declining rate. Now, one of the things I asked, though, or want to do is compare that to the non-Aboriginal rates. So this is Manitoba again. That's that original graph. We saw that really steep, that precipitous decline. And we see this is the white rate right here. So we're looking at the rate of tuberculosis mortality in Manitoba at that time. The white rate went from 38.6 in 1935 per 100,000 to 12.5. The Indian rate, what they would have called the Indian rate at the time, went from almost 2,000 down to 163. So there's still a substantial gap there. And I say when the origins of the inequities, this is a period when we start to see great movement in terms of the differences of the rates. Now, there is decline, but it tends to stabilize, and we start to see these really strong differences between Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal, continue to see Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal differences in rates. And as I said, there's significant differences there. What happens after this is that the mortality rates continue to decline, and then we start measuring morbidity or pure sickness. And you always have the 6 or 10 or 12-fold difference in terms of the rates between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. So if we're looking at tuberculosis, that's what you tend to get. Eventually, however, you do get the decline in the disease. And by decline, I mean a decline down to a point where you're going to find that it's almost below the radar for most people. So most people don't consider tuberculosis as a major problem. It is in some communities, but it's significantly less than it was. So part of that is, should have explained, was the availability of antibiotics and other chemotherapies after the Second World War, which helped to certainly knock that out quite a bit. But you also always see that small difference there, or that significant difference, if you will, which leads us really into the 20th century and the second half of the 20th century, which is the third age, which is the age of degenerative and man-made diseases. So degenerative diseases are typically diseases of old age. As you get older, things break down. You're more likely to be exposed to certain types of disease or develop certain diseases. And there are man-made diseases. And what he means by man-made disease are diseases of lifestyle. As we change our lifestyle, as we don't exercise as much, we eat the wrong things. These are the kinds of things that we sort of inflict upon ourselves. And we've seen quite a bit of that. So that's what we're looking at in terms of the third age. So here's an example. This is from one of my medical geography texts that I use. What you want to look at is not the injury. You want to look at the difference between non-communicable and infectious disease, and the difference between high-income countries and low- and middle-income countries. And you might as easily put in low-income people and high-income people, because what's happening is there have been changes and in terms of lifestyle that have led to sort of separation. So people are more likely to, in rich, wealthy communities, developed world, you're going to look at things like heart disease, certain types of cancer as people live longer, including cancer, lung cancer, and also things like diabetes that isn't on the list as people live longer, but also as a offshoot or a problem associated with the overabundance of calories and the sort of the fat lifestyle and the obesity problems we have. Whereas if you look at the developing world and the low and middle income countries especially, you start to see more importance still of infectious disease. So that's the kind of transition that was occurring in the 20th century in Canada. So part of that is due to aging. So in this case, I've included a couple of population pyramids of Saskatchewan because I'm doing some work on Saskatchewan. It doesn't look it, but it's actually an aging population, even by 1946. So it had been a young population, and that pyramid will tend to slim down, especially at the base as it ages. So you can see a little bit of that's occurring. It's hard to say for sure. We're at about just a bit above replacement level in terms of our fertility rates in Saskatchewan as we are across Canada, except in Aboriginal populations. We're getting older in Saskatchewan as you are across Canada. So the interesting thing then in this case is we're an aging population and we should be and do experience greater numbers of certain diseases. So in this case, it's a wonderful chart that was done by the Saskatchewan Department of Public Health, and it's really hard to read. This is from 1944 to 48 average. This is from 1944 to 28, also averaged. The important thing here is, again, looking at the top section, heart disease, cancer. These are new disease. Heart disease, cancer, nephritis or kidney disease, and intracranial lesions and strokes and things like that. And you see the growth in that. So what's happening as the population is aging, as lifestyle is changing, is even as late, or sorry, this is from 1950, but even as early as that, they're starting to see that transition that Amran documented or looked at in the 1970s. So the Saskatchewan Department of Health was identifying this at the time. What you also see is a decline in certain diseases such as tuberculosis in decline, gonorrhea and enteritis, influenza here, selected communicable disease, which is sort of a mix of them, and then pneumonia as well. So we're starting to see this transition going on actively in Saskatchewan at this time. It's very fascinating. And they're in real time identifying this. Now they do another one later on, I think in probably another 10 years down the road, and they show the decline and changes then. But the idea here is that these are the kinds of changes that are going on across Canada. What we've had is certainly the aging population, and more frequently after that 1970s mark, but even as early as this, and also the change in lifestyle associated with our dietary change and our activity levels. So this is kind of a precursor to what went on later, or is going on now. So in this case, it's another one of theirs from 1949, principal cause of disease. Here's cancer, and here's intracranial lesions. Here's a heart disease. There's tuberculosis in the middle groups, but you start to see that the older folks are much more susceptible to heart disease, cancer, and stroke and things like that. Those are the kinds of things you would expect, but as the population ages, it becomes more and more common. Now, a different, actually, let me go back one, actually two. What isn't shown here is actually a very interesting quote that was, or a piece of information that was provided by a doctor in 1932, Lillian Chase, who was doing a diabetes survey of Saskatchewan at the time. What she couldn't find was incidence of diabetes among First Nations people. So no diabetes among First Nations people, other than maybe a few cases in Saskatchewan at the time. Now, if you know anything about type 2 diabetes, currently it's very much a disease of First Nations and Aboriginal people, but really First Nations people in Canada. It's increasing in the broader population, but it's really something we find in First Nations people. At the time, she could find none, but what she could find was increasing diabetes among the white population. So she's writing in the 1930s, about 1932. What she attributed to, and probably correctly, was the change in diet associated with the depression. So economic change, and I find this interesting given our times, is that as people change their diet because of poverty and because of a lack of access to healthy foods and whatever, they started to develop diabetes at greater rates. So this is a population that's not, they're not genetically predisposed to diabetes or what have you. It's the same population in Saskatchewan, minus however many years, 80 years or whatever. And they're developing higher rates of diabetes simply because they could not afford to purchase healthy foods. So it's a good warning for today, but it's also a warning about what's going on overall in terms of Canadian society. So there's principal cause. So what happens with diabetes in Saskatchewan, in overall in First Nations population, to a lesser extent in Inuit populations, but it's a function. Q Young, who is my postdoctoral supervisor, know that it was a function of rapid social cultural changes. So again, we're looking at changes in culture, changes in economies, experienced in the past several decades. He's writing 2000, probably since about 1970. There's a greater than five-fold risk of death due to diabetes among First Nations on reserve than Canadians in general. So again, elevated, there's that inequity there that we have to deal with, but the idea is that one can argue that they are kind of a bellwether or a proxy of what's going on in Canadian population as a whole. Age-adjusted prevalence in Canada was 3 to 5 times higher among First Nations than Canadians in general, and as high as 25% of the population in some communities, age-adjusted, were victims of diabetes or suffered from diabetes. And many side effects I won't go into. Manitoba First Nation diabetes-related amputations were 16 times that for all Manitobans. There's a couple of things here. One is the fact that they're more likely to have diabetes. The other is that they're less likely to have good health care and good access to good care prior to that. And in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, there's higher incidence of type 2 diabetes in southern communities in the north than in the north, with a few exceptions. One of them was Island Lake, which I did my postdoc on. So an epidemic emerged probably in the 1970s, certainly since the 1980s, but in the 1970s in Canada, first half of the 20th century, almost no type 2 diabetes among First Nations in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Changes in lifestyle that were kind of dictated by the government, by churches, in terms of policy decisions, sending people to residential schools, forcing them off the land, doing all sorts of things like that that had inadvertent side effects, and one of those was the rise of diabetes. There's occasional food issues surrounded by starvation, malnourishment. By the Second World War, nutritional problems in more connected communities, and this is in Manitoba, so scurvy, dental issues in Norway House, overuse of Western foods. So as people are encouraged, they're moved into the kind of a cash economy that includes transfer payments, welfare and other things, old age pensions and what have you. They're given cash, and they often will trade that for foods, Western foods. Part of that, a big part of the problem is that they're buying foods that are not healthy for them, and they have no cultural background in terms of knowing when to stop for certain foods or teaching their children not to eat certain foods. And so what we have then is an overuse of Western foods of the worst type, and initially things like scurvy, when there should be no scurvy, dental health, poor dental health in communities that were more connected. They had better access to white foods. Analysis of body mass index of children entering Saskatchewan and Manitoba residential schools that I did from the 1930s and 50s, well, BMIs were typically low, so these weren't overly obese kids. In fact, there were fairly few obese kids. So at that time, in the 1930s and 1950s, kids were in fairly good shape. It's after that you start to see the problems. Specifically, it's after the 1970s you start to see obesity rates that are much increased. So preliminary analysis of hospital records from 30s to the 70s shows no signs of diabetes or diabetes-related complications. Although sometimes there would be things that could have been possible complications, especially kidney disease and nephritis and what have you, peripheral vascular disease. So some risk factors, well, I won't go into the risk factors. Some of them note, I guess, it would be abdominal obesity, stress, hypertension, overweight, all those kinds of things you find in First Nations populations after 1970, especially with greater stress and cultural change, or after 1945, I should say, especially. Move this along. Where does Canada fit in currently? So if we're looking at where we are now and sort of the late 20th century or into the early 21st century, we're really in an age of degenerative and man-made diseases. So mortality rates and fertility rates are low, they're steady. We have an aging population with little population growth, in other words, that will continue to age, and we're starting to see some of the effects of that. We're seeing rising living conditions, or have seen rising living conditions, perhaps we're seeing falling living conditions among some people, but certainly we're seeing greater money, greater wealth, and greater access to all sorts of different foods. So people are able to buy various types of foods that are not healthy, let's say, although they tend to be associated with poverty too. Life expectancy is higher, 70 plus, several years higher for women than men. Infant mortality rate is low, but morbidity can be very high in terms of, again, things like obesity and what have you. And infectious diseases are on the decline. So we don't really worry too much about infectious diseases, with the odd exception that might be an epidemic of influenza that we fear, HIV/AIDS to a certain extent, and a few others. But we don't worry about tuberculosis. We don't worry about some of those other smallpox or what have you. Those are the kinds of things we don't worry about. We worry more now about things like diabetes and the obesity epidemic and cancer and heart disease especially and what have you. That's where we fit, is the age of degenerative and man-made disease. So risk of degenerative man-made disease is much higher than it has been in the past. So that's where we've come. However, so does this apply to Aboriginal people? And it doesn't necessarily. I mean, in ways it does, and in others it doesn't. So we have, for instance, a late emergence of the age of pestilence and famine. So we have a period of, later period of emergence of these kinds of disease after hundreds of years. It's appeared in overseas in the sort of non-Aboriginal population, but certainly it was later to appear, and also of longer duration. We see post-1945 lower mortality rates, which is a good thing, and population booms accompanying that. But we do see rising importance of chronic diseases. So there is, in some cases, less health, but less mortality. Just as a total aside, I did an ethics application because I was looking at diabetes among First Nations people. This is a biomedical ethics on the medical campus as opposed to the main campus of the University of Manitoba. And what I said was, I found a fairly controversial point, was I said that in some ways Island Lake people were less healthy now than they were 80 years ago, something like that. And I got it back from ethics, and they did not like that statement for whatever reason. Not that they were historical specialists or anything like that, but they wanted to take issue with the fact that I had said that the health had declined on reserve in one community in that period of time. And I could make a very good argument for that. I could make an excellent argument based on the rates of diabetes, based on the rates of tuberculosis, based on all sorts of things. Now, the mortality has declined, but morbidity may have gone up. That is, there's more sickness and obesity and other things like that. So they were trying to sort of vet my research before I could even get to my research through the ethics application. Needless to say, I left it in, and it passed eventually. Q went to bat for me. So infectious disease persists. So they still have problems with infectious disease. So tuberculosis rates are higher. Other kinds of infectious disease are higher still in Aboriginal communities, particularly in First Nation communities. And they're experiencing high rates of diabetes and also of increasing rates of cancer, which traditionally has been fairly low. So they have the worst of all worlds. So I think when we want to differentiate between the sort of the broader community and Aboriginal communities is we've made this transition into the age of modern disease, essentially, and they're still stuck partway between one and the other, actually all three, and they experience a fair amount of suffering because of that. Anyway, I think I've probably taken up enough of your time, so we'll leave it at that. I'd be happy to answer any questions if anyone has them.
Thank you, Paul. We have 20 minutes or a little more for questions, and so if people indicate they're interested in asking one, we'll proceed to see what Paul has to say by way of an answer. Yes, sir.
I'll throw it out. It's very interesting study. First of all, I really enjoyed listening. But I'm just curious, I just recently read stuff on diabetes rates in African American communities in the US, which sounds very, very similar. So I'm just curious, can you speak to any specific difference between First Nations community and African American community? Is there a cultural difference, or I guess, or is it just sort of a socioeconomic reason for this? I'm just curious if you could sort of clarify that.
I would suggest that part of the socioeconomic. There's a certain amount of research that suggests that it's a genetic issue as well. And I think the obesity rates are also higher in African American populations in the States than they are in the broader population. Say normal, that's pretty good to say. But anyway, so I think part of it is there may be a genetic component, and that's been argued in the case of Aboriginal people in Canada, particularly with relation to First Nations. I think it's been over-exaggerated to a certain extent, because I think what's happened is we've seen rapid, massive cultural change in a very short period of time that has led to the kind of conditions that are favorable to that. So we blame it on genetics, so we don't have to deal with it. No, we did that with tuberculosis in Canada. We suggest, as a government, not me personally, but the government suggested that it was related to an inherent weakness on the part of Aboriginal and specifically First Nations. And they also blamed that in terms of smallpox. So going back to the Spanish and the earliest smallpox epidemics, people used to say, well, there's something weak in them because they just simply die like smoke, that kind of idea. It's always used to blame, when in fact there are other reasons for it, and very logical reasons. I think in the case of African Americans, you really have to point to socioeconomic status, I think. I think in their case, foods and maybe exercise patterns and certain dietary and all sorts of other things that go on with poverty. I think that's probably a big portion of it. So if we're looking at any kind of poor community living within a wealthy community, because there are poor communities that don't experience high rates of diabetes, and that may be related to not living within a wealthy community and being forced to eat some of the worst foods around because it's quite cheap. But I think that is the case, I would imagine, and I'm not an expert on the African American population by any means in the United States, but to me that sounds kind of logical. It may to you as well, I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. The transition model.
Yes.
An interesting way to frame a general analysis of disease and Canadian history. The final example challenges that model in several ways, but there are other cases that came to mind while you were speaking that would challenge it too, like the great influenza epidemic at the end of the First World War. So
Yeah.
how do you hope to work with that model and challenge it in the course of writing this chapter?
Yeah, that's a very good point, is that they're not clean. And I think they were never intended to be clean and perfect models. What they are to me is a way of addressing sequence and changes, almost as if you're studying socioeconomic and cultural change by looking at disease. Now, if you turn it on its face, you say, well, how do we look at what's going on in terms of these populations, in terms of their change in lifestyle, change in their whatever? Well, we'll just look at diseases. So in a sense, I'm sort of reversing that, but it isn't clean. And it's funny, I think back in the late 1970s, I think it was the World Health Organization, they just succeeded in killing off smallpox, and they felt really good about it. And they said the age of infectious disease was at an end. Now, within 5 years, we start to see the outbreak of HIV/AIDS, particularly in the United States, but sort of as a worldwide phenomenon. But at that time, early on, so within 5 years, they've been proven to be wrong. And I think that is the case. We still have to worry about these diseases. So on top of all the issues we're going to have with obesity epidemic, with diabetes epidemic, with the heart disease epidemic, with cancer, with everything else, we're still having to worry about some of those diseases. Now, we don't worry about as much about, well, pneumonia is still an issue, but we don't worry as much about influenza these days. We don't worry about diarrhea as a cause of death as much, but globally we sure do. I mean, it's within the top 2, 3 causes of death globally is diarrhea. Diarrhea is right up there, certainly for infants and the vulnerable, but we don't in Canada. I mean, it's not something we consider. So if we're looking at the major causes of death, we're looking at the kinds of things we do and just growing old as in terms of what's going on now. But you're right, something can always knock it on its head come along. So we still have to worry about that. I think maybe there's a greater preoccupation with infectious disease now than there has been for many decades. And a lot of it may be, I don't want to say exaggerated, but certainly it's a really strong public opinion that's come across that we're worried about that next great pandemic that's going to strike. When in fact, we're probably going to die of a heart attack anyways. I had a heart attack a few years ago, and it was ironic, and I used it in my, when I was teaching health geography, I should have showed them my angiogram, but I didn't. But I said, basically I used myself as an example of a person that sort of fits within that pattern. But that's what, how are you going to die? Well, probably a heart attack, cancer, diabetes, all these sorts of things. I don't mean anyone individually, but as a society. And then maybe influenza, maybe less likely HIV/AIDS. We've had great success in terms of treating AIDS over the past certainly decade or what have you. So you're right in the sense that it looks good at one level, but you can always pick it apart going into it. So I'm not intending it to be a model that gives us perfect insight. I'm more using it as a way of structuring our talk or my discussion of disease in Canada.
I was wondering to what extent the persistence of infectious diseases in First Nation communities reflects diseases that have vaccines and or effective treatments and therefore decline in other communities, and or if it's like only non-treatable, tuberculosis or HIV.
Well, tuberculosis has treatments, and we can effectively treat it. And that's probably a good example. It's probably one of the better examples of tuberculosis is that people may refuse to seek treatment, or they may not be aware of treatment, or they may be, Aboriginal communities may be very mistrustful of the medical community. And this is something when I was in community health sciences, which is in the Faculty of Medicine, University of Manitoba, there's a fair amount of discussion with my colleagues about the fact that people didn't want to participate in certain things. Diabetes, in some cases, but tuberculosis, there's a real reluctance because there's imperfect knowledge, and I talked about this again, I think we talked about it before, was that the fact that people didn't have, were kind of living in the past in terms of treatment facility, TB treatment. So they were living in, maybe in the past, certainly of a period when your ribs were removed, your lungs were deflated, some very nasty surgical interventions, or put in a sanatorium for however long, maybe years away from your family, or alternatively, maybe given drugs that didn't taste good, didn't work very well, or what have you. So there's imperfect knowledge there, and the people were not participating. That was part of, I think, people lacking or lacking the will to go seek treatment. On the flip side, there's the government's lack of will to provide treatment. So we have provincial health solutions for Aboriginal people. It's being administered by, say, Manitoba government, and they're quite reluctant to actually get involved in it. They don't want to start having to do all sorts of testing. They do not want to have the levels of TB acknowledged by the public or out to the media or anything like that. So that's part of it. But also we can state, most of the sort of modern population health, public health research suggests that it's not about one thing, it's about a whole complex of things. Poverty, the whole idea of poverty, which opens you up to all sorts of different things. So there's the idea of syndemics, where two different epidemics work together to create a much more negative effect. That's Singer's idea that's coming out now. But there's also the idea of the fact that if you're poor, you tend to suffer more severely and more often from infectious disease and non-infectious disease as well. And if you're looking for cases of poverty or third world conditions or developing world conditions in Canada, look to a First Nations community in the north of any of the provinces, and that's where you're going to find it. Horrible conditions. And that leaves you well open to anything else, including tuberculosis.
The phenomenon of suicide opt in and out of your slides, how does that fit in with your sequence of...
Death by violence, part of the whole model has sort of other death. So the violence may be warfare, and it may be the kinds of things where you're going hunting and you fall through the ice or what have you. The social aspects of violence, whether it's suicide or murder or in some cases dangerous behavior, which may not be suicide, but it sort of does the trick in some cases. A lot of it has to do, I think, and I would argue, is murder was almost unknown in northern Manitoba. I was trying to think, early part of the 20th century, no murder other than the kind of ritual murder, which we call murder, they would call something else, of Wendigo. It was people who would become cannibals and inhabited by cannibal spirits in northern Manitoba. Occasionally happened that you'd have to kill them because they'd become cannibal spirits. Now that was early on prosecuted by the RCMP, and that kind of put a stop to it, and they sent the people off to prison. But there was no murder per se in that situation. There was probably very little at all suicide. So we're looking at the sort of the really heavy colonial period, and again, post-Second World War from northern parts of Manitoba, where people were taken out of their, away from their families, put in schools. I mean, it occurred earlier. It occurred earlier in the South in the sort of 1880s, 1890s in the South. But for the northern part, kids are being taken out of their communities, away from their families, put in schools, losing their language, losing all sorts of things, being exposed to different foods, all of that, which creates a huge sense of loss ultimately and a lack of identity. At the same time, you've got the Canadian society looking down their nose at Aboriginal people. And I don't think, it may not be the case here, but you can cut the racism with a knife in Winnipeg when it comes to dealing with Aboriginal, First Nations people especially. So there's an image problem, if you will, among the media and among the general population. And the people who have sort of, they've internalized a lot of those arguments about being worthless and, a drug addict and drunk and whatever. And a lot of it comes back to just hopelessness and what have you. Now, as a total aside, it can also apply to farm populations. So we've seen in Saskatchewan, for instance, this is different from British Columbia, but we've seen the decline of rural and especially farm populations. So kids are leaving; they're leaving the farm. They're going off to university. to pay my salary, and to new horizons. And so the farms are dying off. The farmers, the older farmers, are having difficulty coming to terms, apparently, with the possible loss of the family farm, having to sell out, having to lose respect, and it's essentially mostly a male thing. So you have men who are engaging in dangerous behavior or in patterns of violence against their spouses and their children because of the decline of farming. So if you think about it, losing your economic base, and in that case, and also losing your place in society, can lead to violence against self or against others. So I'm working on a project, major project, Secura, looking at intimate partner violence across Western Canada, so not including British Columbia, and also the territories. And that's one of the things we're looking at is sort of the situation not only in Aboriginal communities, but also in northern communities, resource communities, and all sorts of places where oftentimes you look, if your identity is linked to certain economic activities and what have you, to lose those, you lose your identity, and it becomes a situation where you may lash out or at others or yourself. So I think it's understandable. There's also the substance abuse issue of that. I think there's a whole mix of things going on, and really, to me, it's it's not something I saw in the 1930s. And looking at the documents, it's not in the 30s. It's not necessarily in the 40s either. It's a fairly modern phenomenon. I'll have to check the rates though, in terms of what the official rates were at the time. But I have the strong suspicion that we're looking at 50s, 60s, 70s as the beginning of this kind of epidemic. And you're right. The rates are much higher among First Nations communities than the broader community. No doubt about it.
Yes.
In your own research, looking at many of these First Nations communities, northern Manitoba, obviously very isolated for a very long time. And then you talk about also that there was a change in the diet and in the food that they ate there. I'm curious if you could talk to me maybe a bit about what were the mechanisms that actually changed the diet. I mean, you talk about how it did eventually open up, but how did the food get there? How did that change happen?
How many are geographers here? You have to explain it by basically geographical. What it is, you've got northern isolated communities who are forced to, not forced to, but certainly were happy to exist on traditional foods in a traditional lifestyle. And you can't separate one from the other. So you go out and hunt and you go out to trap furs and you're hunting your food and whatever. So if you take, the hunting knowledge by taking the kids out of the community, putting them in residential school, teach them English, teach them farming, teach them all sorts of stuff that isn't going to help them when they get back, and also give them all sorts of emotional problems as well. You're removing that generation from that. At the same time, after 1945, you have increasing amounts of cash or transfer payments coming into the community. So if there's money there, someone's going to bring in something to sell you on that. And this, I mean, it went back in the 1830s. They did the exact same thing in certain communities where lumbermen would start selling things on the side and whatever. But in this case, you've got a ready supply of cash from child allowance and other pensions and what have you, and welfare, and nothing to spend it on except for these new foods. And the problem with the new foods is that they taste really good. I remember we did an oral histories with some elders from Island Lake. And they talked about first tasting flour. And flour, yum, okay, bread, bannock, whatever, okay. They loved it. They absolutely loved it, could not get enough. And now here's a change in diet that you think, well, why would suddenly people start eating mass amounts of flour? But it was something new and something that you didn't have a sort of, you shouldn't really eat a loaf of bread or something, at a sitting or whatever. But I'm exaggerating, but that's the idea, is that became something that they could spend the money on, that they could eat, and they would enjoy. And later on, you start to see fried chicken outfits up in Island Lake. It's a fly-in community with a winter road for 2 weeks a year, but they have a fried chicken outfit there. And they have, I was there, 2004, I think it was, and every kid had a bag of candy and chips and Coke. It's an old story on the prairies. If you do any work with Aboriginal peoples, you start to look at dental health, and it's abysmal among children from northern communities. But also that there is a tendency to drink, to consume these things because they've got the money. They're fairly cheap. They're cheaper than actually healthy foods. And this comes back to a core area in Vancouver or a core area in Winnipeg, is that it's cheaper to eat crap than it is to eat good food. So when you talk about eating your heart out, that's part of it. So that's what was happening. So it was actually what we found, I figured out I'm sure it was common knowledge to everybody else, was it was much cheaper to bring in things because they bring in semis on winter roads, so huge trucks full of non-perishable goods. So it's cheap to put in a whole bunch of Coke, chips, candy bars, everything like that. It's stuff that's relatively won't damage and it won't go bad. Whereas milk, you have to bring up milk repeatedly. So a price of, I want to say $8 a liter, maybe more, 12 bucks a liter for milk, $2 for 2 liters of Coke. So what are you going to drink? Now, for their children, in some cases, they were giving the kids bottles that were either filled not so much with Coke, but with Kool-Aid. Kool-Aid was a big one for giving the kids at night. So you give them a bottle of Kool-Aid and they drink that at night. So that's one of the reasons your teeth are so bad and potentially lead to diabetes. And the kids would drink Coke all the time. So, I mean, it was almost the worst things you could take from various places and putting them in there. They also have problems with gang influences up in the north as well. And part of that is cultural. They're looking to California for some of their trends in terms of gang lifestyle, and to Winnipeg as well. Anyway, so that's the sort of thing is that, you know, it's very complex in terms of the culture change. A lot of it is very recent, I would argue, very recent. And it's easier to get in the mess than it is to get out of the mess. And now we're having to get out of the mess. So if you look at Manitoba Health and the predictions for how much it's going to cost the province of Manitoba and the federal government in terms of health care for Aboriginal people in the next 10, 20, 30 years, it's huge. But we got in the mess, now we have to get out of the mess. And you can't do it just by focusing on diabetes, even though that's what a lot of medical doctors will want. What you have to do is focus on the broader range of health problems, socioeconomic problems, everything on that reserve, and psychological and psychosocial problems.
Okay, we'll have one more question, and Tina.
Sure. Well, it has to do with it picks up on what Stephen just asked you, and on your getting out of the mess. I'm just wondering about, my big question is, what's the influence of self-government on health? And I'll just start with a very small example. I was fortunate enough to be in Grise Fiord a number of years ago. And throughout the north, in Grise Fiord as other places, there are co-ops. Co-ops are the places where you get your groceries, whether that's crap or good milk or pop. And the co-ops are community-run businesses, as you know. And they're the one opportunity that many of these communities have to exercise some sort of governance over themselves, in this case over food, though. And what was absolutely fascinating about the co-op in Grise Fiord was that the community decided that it confronted with an epidemic of obesity, that they are actually going to do a little bit of market intervention, and they're going to differentially price the stuff in the co-op so that milk was not so much more expensive.
Are they subsidizing it?
Yeah, they're going to subsidize
Good
it.
thing, right?
They knew people were going to buy pop anyway, so they're going to charge a lot more. For
And then try to use that to subsidize the
and
milk.
they would subsidize the milk and the fruit, which also costs a fortune. And
Yeah.
in that way, they were actually making an intervention and trying to overcome distance with their own subsidization plan. And it was because they could act, it was a community-run organization that could make those kinds of decisions.
They have autonomy in that situation. Or
Well, they
at least a
did,
level
but
of
there
autonomy.
are co-ops across the north, as you know.
Well, we actually, a lot of
So
communities
just
have
wondering-
northern stores.
Yeah.
So they were once owned by the Hudson's Bay Company and
Right.
been sold off to an independent store.
So Northmart, maybe,
Yeah.
they're the places with the fried chicken.
Yes,
outlets,
oh,
which
yeah.
I've seen.
What that, was Wendy's? No,
Pizza Hut is
KFC,
what I've
yeah.
seen.
All sorts of things that you would recognize here are there.
But in those situations where there are co-ops, do you have a sense that there are sorts of steps that are being taken by those communities in question to kind of assert themselves in that way? Because that was really quite remarkable.
I think it's great. I haven't been up north for a while, so I'm out of the loop on that. I do know that in Island Lake they are working on garden plots.
Yeah,
So one of
like
the solutions is actually to make fresh vegetables available, local fresh vegetables available. Same thing with meats and what have you. So I think there are solutions there in terms of portions of this whole problem. And people have free will, and if they like sugar, they're going to eat sugar. So part of this has to be education, and the education of the very young, and that's, you're looking at other mandates there as well. But if the province and the federal government are going to be on the hook for tens of, or however many millions of dollars, it makes much more sense to implement some sort of long-term solution right now than to wait until you have a problem. Now, governments are notoriously short-sighted in terms of any kind of solution, and that's what we found in Manitoba, was that they loved the interventions that were fairly cheap but would have some sort of spectacular impact in the short term. But if you had something that was maybe a little bit more expensive or even fairly cheap, but didn't have the positive thing for 20 years, they were less interested in that. So the kind of, public health, population health approach, they want the medical approach, but let's change it a bit. But I certainly would applaud that. I think that's a great idea. It suggests you have to have autonomy. I know there are certain communities that have banned, obviously, alcohol at their bootleggers, including on Lake, I believe. People who bootleg and also people who bring it in illegally. That's one of the interesting things about Island Lake is they have these semis, but some of them, they're also on the winter roads. People driving south to Winnipeg and then bringing back huge carloads of alcohol or drugs in some cases as well. So in a community that's fine, you would think would be traditional, is not traditional anymore. It hasn't been for many years. But you go back to the 1940s, and it isn't in the talk, but it's one of the things that I found quite key, was Island Lake was quite traditional back in the 1940s. So they're, compared to Norway House, which is a community that has better connections, has a long history of interaction with the broader society, and had a steamboat, for God's sakes, in the 19th century going up to Lake Winnipeg. But it's not a very far distance. They were eating rotten foods, their health was much poorer, and this is in 1945 or something like that. And a matter of less than 100 miles. It can make a huge difference, all the difference in the world, just to be on that sort of divide of some sort of imaginary geographical line where it's no longer cost effective to transport that. Until you give them money and then in which case it is cost effective.